Thank you very much. It's good to be back. The hope of this talk is that we'll think together about ways in which we perceive harmony in its presence in creation. And the title I gave to this, it's always weird. You get a call 4 months before you give a talk, and you need a title and a description. And so I think, well, what can I say? I have no idea what I'm going to say yet, but try to figure out how to summarize it. And then I have to try to actually say that. So David got in touch with me, and at the very last minute, I came up with this title, Let Our Ordered Lives Confess. The subtitle, Nurturing Symphonic Souls in a Chaotic Culture. Some of you, how many know where the title of that comes from? Some of you know that line. It's a line from a poem by John Greenleaf Whittier. You may have sung it in a hymn, Dear Lord and Father of Mankind. I'm going to read the first stanza. Dear Lord and Father of mankind, forgive our foolish ways, reclothe us in our rightful mind. In purer lives thy service find, in deeper reverence praise. Whittier was a Quaker, and this poem, not surprisingly, associates reverence with quiet, with deep hushes, with stillness, with silence. And the title for my talk comes from the next to the last stanza, which petitions the Lord in this way, drop thy still dews of quietness, till all our strivings cease. Take from our souls the strain and stress, and let our ordered lives confess the beauty of thy peace. Now, for some reason, when I sang this hymn, I think I was like 12 or 13, maybe 14, probably closer to 12 when I first sang it. And it seemed so calming and assuring to me. Those last two lines were very attractive. Let our ordered lives confess the beauty of thy peace. And those lines come to me very often when I can't remember the rest of the poem. It may be because late adolescence is a time of many stresses and strains and very little order or peace. And I have to confess, I was probably more attached to the idea of order than that of beauty. And it was only later in life that I realized the wisdom of the idea that the peace that God gives not as the world gives, is an instance of beauty. It's not just things lined up nicely. The living of beautiful lives that could echo the beauty of God requires some kind of order rather than frantic, if sincere, improvisation. So when I was told that the theme of the conference was harmony and asked to give a title to the talk I hadn't yet written, that stanza came to mind, and I thought whatever I would end up saying about harmony would resonate with the idea of well-ordered lives. Now, as I was rereading the poem last week, I thought, well, it would seem that verse, that next to the last verse, would be a nice thing for display on the wall in your teacher's lounge. Drop thy still dews of quietness till all our striving cease. Take from our souls the strain and stress, and let our ordered lives confess the beauty of thy peace. Now go out and teach. Or perhaps just the final two lines of the last stanza. Speak through the earthquake, wind, and fire. Oh, still small voice of calm. Teaching may be more apocalyptic than... Earlier in the poem, Whittier refers to the experience of Jesus praying to the Father as enjoying the silence of eternity interpreted by love. Now, like I said, this is more of a Quaker spin. I tend to think that eternity is not going to be as silent. I think of glorious harmony and brass. I think there will be brass. It'd be like being in Venice in the late 16th century, I think, early 17th century. But there is a relationship between music and silence, and hence I think silence is related to harmony. The relationship between music and silence isn't entirely one of contrast. About the same time that I first encountered Whittier's poem, I was singing in a high school choir, and I was learning a motet by Johann Sebastian Bach, and I remember being told by our teacher, and this was the first time I worked with a really well-trained musician, he told us we had to sing through the rests. Sing through the rest. Some of you are singers, you've probably heard voice coaches or conductors telling you that. And that just seems so weird to me. How do you sing through the rest? Even during the silence, the music is continuing. And somehow, as a performer, you have to sell the fact that the music is being conveyed even in the silence, which is a remarkable thing. I was recently reading about the Estonian composer Arvo Pärt, and it's spelled P-A umlaut R-T. So it looks like part with something German attached to it. Pärt turns 80 this year, and apparently, I think Peter Phillips, the conductor of the Tallis Scholars, they just released a wonderful new CD. They've invited people to take selfies holding the CD, and they're sending them all to Arvo Pärt for his birthday this fall. I have taken a vow never to do a selfie, so I can't participate. But I told my staff, just shoot me if you ever catch me taking a picture of myself. Paul Hillier, who's a conductor who's performed a lot of Arvo Pärt's music, in a book about Pärt, writes, all music emerges from silence, to which sooner or later it must return. At its simplest, we may conceive of music as the relationship between sounds and the silence that surrounds them. When we create music, we express life, but the source of music is silence, which is the ground of our musical being, the fundamental note of life. How we live depends on our relationship with death. How we make music depends on our relationship with silence. Let's just stop there and think about that for the next hour. Well, no. Leisure, the Basis of Culture, a lot of you know. I'm assuming that there are copies of it for sale back there. Josef Pieper's wonderful book that I find on many bookshelves of teachers in the classical school world. And you may recall that in his effort to define what he means by leisure, that it's not like a Barca lounger moment. It's something a little more intense than that. Pieper writes, leisure is a form of silence. Of that silence which is the prerequisite of the apprehension of reality. Only the silent hear, and those who do not remain silent do not hear. Silence, as it is used in this context, does not mean dumbness or noiselessness. It means more nearly that the soul's power to answer to the reality of the world is left undisturbed. For leisure is a receptive attitude of mind, a contemplative attitude, and it is not only the occasion but also the capacity for steeping oneself in the whole of creation. And right at the end, he returns, I think, implicitly to this idea of cosmic harmony, that we perceive the cosmic harmony from this posture of receptivity, not a kind of dumb silence, but an expectant silence. We can only perceive if we have the capability and the willingness to be still and to know from the things that he has made that God is God. You may recall the lines from T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. Where shall the word be found? Where will the word resound? Not here, there is not enough silence. It's odd that I was attracted to these sentiments as a young person, because I ended up majoring in film studies and broadcasting, where we were basically learning how to make a lot of noise in people's lives. And maybe it was God's way of kind of reminding me of what not to do. We will not be able to perceive the harmony of creation, which is a harmony sustained by the Logos, unless we have a well-ordered receptivity. And that receptivity is not just a mental or spiritual attitude, though it is essentially that. It's more than that. I think it requires the attentiveness of the senses. we have to learn how to attend to the world physically. The harmony of creation is not an abstract concept on which we merely meditate as if we're brains in vats. The harmony of creation is an experienced reality with those who have ears to hear and eyes to see. There's a tendency in the Western tradition, I think, to over-spiritualize beauty and harmony, to make them into abstractions that are best experienced in the mind rather than in the body. But the remarkable event of the Incarnation means that there is right now a human body, a body with 5 senses perceiving, in which the fullness of the deity dwells. Even today and forever, the dust of the earth is on the throne of heaven. Sometimes people talk about a God's eye view as if it's kind of abstracted from the physical world. Well, because of the Incarnation, the God's eye view of reality is on a dusty road in the Middle East, smelling things and hearing things and tasting things. So while harmony is more than we can experience with our ears, it's not less. Because we've been made with bodies, God has given us the delightful capacity to experience musical harmony, which I'd like to think of musical harmony as love made audible. Others have argued this week that harmony is an attribute of the Trinity, and in God's work of creation, harmony is a bestowed good within the creation, a good that is known through our bodies, particularly, not exclusively, but particularly by means of musical expression, as well, I think, in other sense experiences. It's not the case that we, as human beings, in some evolutionary process, discovered pleasant sounds in music and then at some later date anthropomorphically projected those human cultural inventions onto God. It's exactly the opposite of that. Our capacity to perceive and delight in harmony in music is a gift from God, a gift that's capable of cultivation, so that we can better sense or perceive in a co-natural manner the beauty and goodness of harmony in the Trinity. We live in it. And so if that's the case, then we might say that participation in harmonic beauty in music is a kind of participation in the life of God. Now, I hope that every teacher here goes away from this conference with a desire to enable their students to perceive the witness that creation bears to the transcendent harmony in the life of the Trinity. And I can think of no better practical advice than to urge you, and here I have to be careful not to raise my voice or my blood pressure, to urge you to teach your students to sing in harmony with one another. I'm going to riff on that a little bit. They gave me the podium. When man was created, God breathed life into him. It wasn't a spark like a Frankenstein thing. It was breath. It's fascinating to me how, as I listen to interviews with musicians who aren't singers, oboe players and violin players and even drummers, how often they refer to singing their music through the instrument. Singing is the primal form of music. So even instrumentalists think of vocalizing through their instruments. That is, projecting their exhalations. God breathes life into us. We breathe out into the world in music. And when we sing, our breath is transformed into living vibrations that we share with one another. So when we sing with one another, our bodies make each other's bodies vibrate. Okay? At least your eardrums. If I'm singing a lot louder, more possibly, but. And so music sung together, harmony experienced together, creates a kind of a physical sympathy. And if we do it attentively and even skillfully, footnote, Augustine says, he who sings well prays twice, not just he who sings prays twice. I'm sorry, it's just, I just work here, it's in the book. If we do it skillfully, in tune, the experience of harmony achieves a kind of divine arithmetic whereby, as Arvo Pärt has observed, 1 + 1 = 1. there's still a unity in that harmony. There's one sound, one chord, one harmonic reality, even as many voices are united. In his book on musical aesthetics, Roger Scruton has written that the experience of musical harmony is the experience, quote, of voices sounding together, moving in concord, creating tensions and resolutions, filling the tonal space with an image of community. Classical harmony provides us with an archetype of human sympathy. The ability to notice a bass line, to feel the rightness of the notes and of the harmonies that erupt from them, is the ability to respond to a wider world, to value the other voice, and to situate both self and other in a moralized universe. So, what might we say? What do we make? How might we evaluate the fact that much of the 20th century's musical culture has involved a retreat from harmony, a denial of harmony, a marginalizing of harmony, a thumbing of the nose to the idea of harmonic beauty? What does the bodily participation in music that eschews harmony, that delights in the denial of harmony, not simply the tension of a passing dissonance, but the celebration of chaos, what does participation in that involve? I don't think it's an accident that the 20th century has seen, both in classical music and in popular music, experiments in the deliberate devaluation of harmony. The 20th century is the most secularized of ages in human history. It's the era in which the idea of transcendent order that was knowable through the experience of beauty has been defiantly denied, and so we would expect such an age to foster forms of musical expression that excel in arbitrary self-expression and the sheer power of disordered sound. Sound that engages the body, but not the heart or the mind. A preoccupation with power in cultural expression is something that we should expect in modernity. A preoccupation with power accompanies the modern preoccupation with the will, with the triumph of the will, and we see it in many forms, including sports and dance and technology and music. Roger Scruton says somewhere that people no longer dance with each other, they dance at each other. It's an expression of power and willfulness. Harmony has a kind of power, but it's a power rooted in mutual interaction and mutual submission to a shared order. In music theory, the term tonality is used to refer to a harmonic system whereby a sense of home is established in a piece of music around a particular note. And melodies and harmonies within a tonal composition are ordered around that home note and a home key, either major or minor, that grows out of that home note. Think of the tune to Somewhere Over the Rainbow. That first note, the one on which Judy Garland sang some, is the home note. And the second note, where, goes up a full octave, which is kind of like home. It's the second home. It's the home away from home. It's a note that's vibrating, as John pointed out, with that wonderful, I don't know how you do that thing with the, was that a phone cable? What was that cable you used? That was so good. That is so cool, yeah. He is the most wired guy I know, I tell you. It's vibrating, that where is vibrating exactly twice as fast as the some note. It's a higher version of home, okay? It's an elevated home. So, as it happens, that higher home note is also the very last note in the song. Why, oh, why can't I? She goes up to the same note. She starts down an octave lower. And when she sings that last note, the melody's coming back home, even if she and Toto still aren't in Kansas anymore. Music with a tonal center has the ability and fulfills the desire to come home, often repeatedly, and each arrival is usually aesthetically satisfying. Now, many Western composers in the 20th century early 20th century, expressed anxiety, skepticism, or disdain toward the practice of tonality. You see this happening in the late 19th century. Gustav Mahler's Ninth Symphony, for instance, which was composed at the end of the century's first decade, announced, as Leonard Bernstein said, the death of tonality. Bernstein hears in the very last movement of Mahler's Ninth a prayer for the restoration of life, of tonality, of faith, but there are no solutions. Bernstein hears this as a very pessimistic piece of music about the end of tonality. The 20th century, Bernstein said in his 1973 Norton Lectures at Harvard, the 20th century is a century of death and Mahler is its musical prophet. By the abandoning, the eschewing of tonality. The leading school that cultivated the denial of let me call it normal tonality, was called serialism, a very radical form of atonal composition. And Anton Webern, who was one of the prophets of that movement, once observed that tonality didn't just die, we broke its neck. The homeless spirit of atonality sometimes expressed musical rage. Pierre Boulez's Second Piano Sonata, written in the late 1940s, there are notes to the performer in the score. They include these kinds of instructions: more and more staccato and brutal, still more violent, pulverize the sound, quick, dry attack, stay without nuances at a very high volume. This is about power and violence. Serialism was a musical vocabulary that was well suited to express fear and terror and despair and dejection, but not positive human emotions. Abandoning musical harmony, I think, was an expression of the repudiation of love. There's a prominent American serialist composer, George Rochberg, who abandoned who was kind of the poster child among American composers for serialism. But in 1964, after his teenage son died, he started moving away from serialism. I actually produced an interview. I met him in 1976 when I worked for NPR, and I produced an interview with him. And he said during that interview that serialism gave him no vocabulary to express grief. Rage, yes. Grief, no. And with the death of his son, he needed a musical vocabulary of grief, and it wasn't there. So he began to return to harmony. He said in an interview later, this is actually reported in the New York Times in his obituary, a 1983 interview, George Rochberg said, "Modernism ended up allowing us only a postage stamp size space to stand on. We cut the rest away." Arvo Pärt, I mentioned a minute ago, was born in 1935 in Estonia. Saw first the Germans and then the Soviets overrun his country. Pärt was studying composition when the techniques of serialism were all the rage, one could say. And his earliest compositions displayed an agility in using the vocabulary of these atonal techniques. But as his career developed, his works increasingly displayed a deliberate contrast between the moods of tonality, of traditional harmony, and this kind of violent repudiation of harmony. In 1966, he wrote a piece called Pro et Contra, which includes alternating passages of very complex dissonance and very simple and delicate consonants. Paul Hillier, the conductor I quoted earlier about silence, Hillier suggests that this work is an exercise of conflict and contrast, quote, between the ordered world of tonality and the increasingly disturbed chaos of its absence. In 1968, Pärt wrote a work called Credo, and it wasn't the traditional setting of the Creed that most works called Credo are. It was scored for piano, chorus, and orchestra. It's a very pivotal work for Arvo Pärt because it's the last of his so-called collage compositions in which he contrasts the atonal chaos with the tonal peacefulness. And Hillier says, the glimpses of tonality in these works are like intimations of some paradisiacal, and that I always have trouble saying that word. It's an adjectival form of paradise, of a paradisiacal garden from which exile is felt to be increasingly futile. In the early 1970s, Arvo Pärt underwent 2 conversions. He joined the Russian Orthodox Church, and he also began a very intense study of early music. In an interview I read recently, I knew he had studied Gregorian chant. What I didn't know is that he was in a record store somewhere and heard about 4 seconds of Gregorian chant, and he'd never heard such a simple melodic line before, and it just captivated him. And he began an intense study of early chant, some of the earliest medieval polyphony, some of the examples of which John played for us yesterday, and the very early Renaissance masters, especially those from the Low Countries. There were a lot of people. Josquin des Prez is the best-known composer from what is now the Netherlands and Belgium, who were absolute masters of multi-voice, of harmony. These were prophets of harmony. I think the Holy Spirit was very active during this time. And finally, he interacted with the composers of the High Renaissance, Palestrina and Victoria, the 2 giants of late Renaissance polyphony. But what's interesting about his experience of this is he came, most music students, they learn, they've played Beethoven, they know some Mozart, they learn some Bach, and then they go back to Palestrina. And they see Palestrina as kind of a forerunner of all these later guys. What Arvo Pärt experienced it the other direction. He spent about 10 years, actually, coming to understand what was going on in these later composers from the standpoint of the whole evolution of harmonic development. So the mature composers were the culmination of centuries of melodic and harmonic development, not the primitive predecessors of the music of the 18th and 19th century, as their work is usually experienced. And in engaging these works, he set about to recover a sense of how harmony worked by rediscovering what melody was. What is a melody? So he actually worked. I think it was over 10 years. He wouldn't write more than 1 musical line. He didn't write any harmonic. He wouldn't add a second line. He was like a painter relearning the basics of drawing. He devised exercises to retrain his musical imagination. And again, remember, this is all a way of purging the chaos that he'd been trained in. The chaos of serialism and the abandonment of harmony. How can I rediscover what harmony is? Paul Hillier explains he would draw a shape, such as the outline of wings or a landscape, and then he would create a melodic line that would fill the shape. Or he would quickly read a text and set it aside, and I have since found out that he was often reading Psalms. He would read a text, set it aside, and then immediately write music to mirror what he had just heard. Just 1 line of music, just a line of melody. And eventually he sought to recover tonality. That is, the honoring of tradition notions of harmony as the basis for his musical composition. Paul Hillier has commented that this radical renewal of musical language has often been dismissed as a retreat into the past or as yet another 20th century example of recycling an earlier musical idiom, but Hillier doesn't think that's the case. He argues that it's plausible to perceive in Pärt's music that tonality is not just a symbol for God, but actually a manifestation of God, which is remarkably sacramental language for a conductor and a musicologist to use, in my experience. But Pärt's music is so powerful that it seems to force lots of people, sometimes against their druthers, toward theological speech. Now, it's a remarkable story that in the past 50 years, we've seen a revival and a recovery of harmony, and the confident rejection of harmony that characterized the first half of the 20th century has been challenged by some of the most respected composers of the present time. But, meanwhile, at the level of everyday experience, I worry that the experience of harmony is less of a presence in the lives of many Christians. A few years ago, I gave a talk at a Christian college on how the culture of the church should be different from the culture of the world, how we should be constructively and creatively countercultural. And before my talk, the entire student body, a group about this size, maybe bigger, it was a small school, sang a hymn. And they sang that joyous and confident hymn, All Creatures of Our God and King. And they were singing from hymnals that featured the traditional harmonization that Ralph Vaughan Williams wrote. So if you've sung that hymn, you've probably heard his harmonization of it. And I thought, oh, what a wonderful way to start this gathering. The text of the hymn is a paraphrase of a poem by St. Francis of Assisi, and it portrays the harmonious song of all creation, joining in music, sun and moon, wind and clouds, fire and water, flowers and fruits, all joining in harmony to praise God. And if you know the classic setting, you know that Ralph Vaughan Williams decided to set the first line, all creatures of our God and King, lift up your voice and with us sing in unison. So everybody sings that in unison. But then, when you get to the Alleluia, Alleluia, all heaven breaks loose. And we sing in harmony, and we sing in this glorious harmony. So you move from that unison line to interactive harmony, which has the effect of, it's like that moment in Wizard of Oz when the color turns on. Everything's in color. You move from black and white to color. It displays both the unity and the diversity of creation's praise. 1 + 1 = 1. So that morning at this college, the pianist is doing a really good job supporting the singing, and we start the first verse and we get to the Alleluias. And I suddenly discovered I'm the only one singing in harmony. I was singing the tenor part very dutifully. And probably loudly. And I'm the only one who's not singing the melody line. I thought, well, they'll warm up. They'll get to it eventually. And we sang like 6 verses, and never was heard a harmonic word, okay? I was the only one singing something other than the melody line. Neither students nor faculty were affirming with their voice the harmonious diversity or the diverse harmony of creation. Now that text summons us to communal harmonic rather than unison expression. The hymn is about cosmic hymning. It's about the whole creation singing. And when we sing this hymn, the church is, in a sense, enacting its mediatorial role for the rest of creation. We're not just making an intellectual statement about this. We're not just declaring our theology. We are actually we are speaking for creation. We have this priestly role here. And we're lifting up our voices on behalf of the sun and the moon and the stars and the wind and the clouds and the water and the fire. But when we fulfill this role and only employ voices in unison, we miss the whole point of St. Francis's poem, which itself is based on Psalm, I think it's 148, which is all about the remarkable range of diverse voices that unite to praise their Creator in harmony. It's a hymn that conveys the glory of God by cataloging the array of praisers in creation fittingly and diversely joining in psalm. Musical harmony is the delightful gift we've been given to enable us to express and participate in the harmony of heaven and earth. And I say heaven because Psalm 148, the basis for the poem, begins by referring to angelic praise. There are angels that are part of this song with us, and their voices are really different. And they know notes we don't even know, I'm sure. But that kind of participation is participation ultimately in the harmony of Father, Son, and Spirit, the three in one God, honored in the final verse of the hymn. And I think that we come to know this harmony and not just know about it by singing in harmony, by giving and receiving to one another the diverse vibrations of our voices. But that morning, when this hymn was sung by hundreds of college students, no one seemed to know how to harmonize. They didn't know because the churches in which they'd been raised have neglected or possibly deliberately repudiated the responsibility to disciple them musically. Their churches assume that young people will somehow be adequately discipled by mass media, which, given the profoundly confused state of our culture, seems to me to be an odd assumption. So these young people didn't have the resources to love one another musically. Their singing was hearty, but it was two-dimensional, or black and white. 2 generations ago, I venture to say, such a sizable assembly of young people from Christian families would have included a significant proportion capable of making harmony and not just singing about it. And our praise would have been more fully representative of what Psalm 148 is about. This is why I urge you as schools to teach your children how to do that, which may mean for some of you learning how to do it yourselves. We live in a culture that is confused and chaotic and disjointed and fragmented. Wendell Berry speaks of the various piecemealings of our culture. We might think of our condition as one of dismembering. Since things that God has harmoniously joined together, we are intent on dismembering. But the experience of harmony is the practice of remembering the world, which is why we need to be more deliberate in cultivating the disciplines that enable us to remember. Attentiveness to acoustic experience and harmony is a case in point of the remarkable gift that we have of perceiving the intelligibility of creation in its harmony with our bodies through our senses. I often cite a text in my lectures, and you probably heard me cite 1 Kings, the end of 1 Kings chapter 4, beginning at verse 29, which is about the remarkable wisdom of Solomon. I want to use that as a jumping off point for some ideas about our perception in our bodies of the intelligibility of creation. God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all other men, wiser than Ethan the Ezrahite and Heman and Calcol and Darda, the sons of Mahol, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. I love that 5 there. Not just 1,000. We're not going to 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and of birds and of reptiles and of fish. And people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. There are some remarkable assumptions which counter modern assumptions about nature. Solomon's wisdom is expressed in poetic form, proverbs and songs. It's not in abstract theories or utilitarian bullet-pointed tips for living. Second, Solomon's wisdom concerns the intelligible order of creation. He's looking at animals and plants and perceiving from them wisdom about God's ways. The source of his wisdom applicable in many areas of life, is reflection enabled by the perception of the senses of the things that God has made. The fear of the Lord is the origin of wisdom, but its trajectory takes wisdom through regions that are shaped by sensory experience of the givenness of creation. Ever since Galileo announced that the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics, there's been an increasing loss of confidence that the universe is meaningful and intelligible to normal human experience through the senses. We're no longer confident that God has created things like trees and reptiles and fish to be sources of meaningfulness and wisdom to people without sophisticated technologies and advanced theories. In his book, Enlightenment and Alienation, theologian Colin Gunton discussed how many Western philosophies have dismissed the meaningfulness of sense perception, the ability of normal human experience to convey reliable knowledge of creation. Many philosophical discussions of perception, Gunton wrote, begin with the fact of error and illusion. That is, because we can misperceive through our senses, many thinkers ask whether it may be the case that we always misperceive, so we can't trust our senses. What happens in the world of perceptual skepticism, as Gunton calls it, is that all the information gained by the senses tends to be classed as opinion or belief, which is then distinguished sharply from another class of information, which is gained by pure reason, apart from the body. Perception and reason then come to be seen as entirely different, even competing ways to knowledge. It seems to me that the biblical view is that the world perceived by the senses is intelligible and meaningful. That transcendent harmony is not just an intellectual inference or a conclusion of brains in vats, but it's something experienced through the senses. But modern thinking about the relationship between reason and the body holds otherwise. We are still profoundly shaped by the ideas of René Descartes. There's a very clarifying passage in Descartes where he says, I can infer correctly that my essence consists solely in the fact that I am a thinking thing. I am a thinking thing. It is true that I may have, and then he puts in parentheses, or to anticipate that I certainly have a body. I love that. I may have a body, and then he's writing, well, yes, I do, of course. I certainly have it. That is very closely joined to me. Oh, hello, body. But nevertheless, on the one hand, I have a clear and distinct idea of myself insofar as I am simply a thinking, non-extended thing. And on the other hand, I have a distinct idea of a body insofar as this is simply an extended, non-thinking thing. And accordingly, it is certain that I am really distinct from my body and can exist without it. That's part of the Gnosticism of modernity, courtesy of Descartes. But despite the influences of Descartes and his heirs, there are dissenting voices among modern thinkers who've rejected that. Michael Polanyi is one, philosopher of science, who argued that we know the world and come to understand it through sense experience. And there are good theological reasons for this. The world is created and given its coherence, as we confessed in our reading of Colossians this morning, by the Logos who became incarnate. That is, all things are created and sustained and are coherent, made coherent by the Logos who entered the world, the Logos who became flesh. And so, as Gunton puts it, the world is a proper place for human beings to use their senses as well as minds and imaginations, and to expect they will not be wholly deceived in doing so. Theologian T.J. Gorange has argued that the material world is not foreign to God, but the material world is a form of God's self-expression. The good in creation is perceived through the senses. The good takes form in color, texture, tonality, density, aroma, taste. Creation is fitted with goodness, and we are fitted with senses to perceive that goodness. I want to close with some reflections about the capacities of various senses. And this is very sketchy. I'm not sketchy in the sense of dubious, but sketchy in the sense of it's a sketch, it's an outline. Fill in the details. Although you may think, yep, good job, Ken. It is sketchy. I want to talk about the capacities of various senses. How do the senses convey the world differently to us? How do they convey, but in a unified way, the essentially harmonious quality of creation? Because harmony is an attribute of creation, it's not just a concept that we attach to creation. Harmony is intelligible and knowable, and we know it through the senses. Let me begin with hearing. The Anglican priest and hymn writer John Marriott observed that while the first thing created, light, is correlated with our sense of sight, it was the speech of God that called light into being, and the speech of God does have a kind of priority in creation before the light is there. There's a wonderful hymn, it's actually Marriott's hymn, Thou whose almighty word chaos and darkness heard and took their flight. Hear us, we humbly pray, and where the gospel day sheds not its glorious ray, let there be light. Jeffrey Wainwright, who wrote a very interesting book called For Our Salvation, half of which is a reflection on how the senses convey grace to us, observes that much of the writing of the four Gospels is occupied with the spoken words of the Word made flesh. Hearing was the way in which the revelation of Christ was initially received. Jesus' spoken words illuminate the truth. He speaks as the Father taught him, and he gives his words to his disciples. He tells the disciples, he who hears you hears me. Hearing being more than merely oral reception, but equated with assent to the message. St. Paul affirms the fact that faith comes by hearing, hearing through the word of Christ. John, in 1 John, we read, "We declare to you what was from the beginning, what we have heard," he says first. Walter Ong, in his book, The Presence of the Word, argues that sound, and particularly in words, the inner life of a person is made manifest. Their interiority comes to the surface. He writes, "Because the spoken word moves from interior to interior, encounter between man and man is achieved largely through voice. Encounters with others in which no words are ever exchanged are hardly encounters at all." Ong also observes, and others have said the same thing, that sound tends to orient us in time while sight orients us in space. If you're in a strange place or you awaken in a strange place, this happened to me a few years ago after I was unconscious for 13 hours, having suffered a serious heart attack and woke up in a hospital room and didn't know where I was. I looked around to try to figure out where I was. Where are the lights? Where are things? Sounds are experienced with a duration and a rhythm, and hence we are oriented in time with hearing. If I'm in a strange place late at night and I hear a strange noise, I'm immediately anticipating the next instance of that noise. I'm temporally alert at that point. My sense of time is heightened. I may look around to figure out where the noise came from and get a clue as to what caused it, but my more immediate concern is whether or not it'll happen again. And so I'm suddenly very strongly situated in time. Music, the ordering of sound, is very much about the experience of time, because meaningfulness in music is often about anticipation and fulfillment, about leaving home and returning. So we are oriented temporally, often through our ears, through hearing. We talk about sight for a few minutes. Light is the first thing called into being by God, and John 1 echoes Genesis 1's declaration of the presence of visual revelation. "The Word became flesh, and we have beheld His glory. No one has ever seen God, the only Son who is in the bosom of the Father, He has made Him known. This is the God who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' who has shone in our hearts to give the light of the knowledge of the glory of God in the face of Christ." That's in 2 Corinthians 4. We could spend all day looking at the imagery of light in Scripture, Old and New Testament. The common claim that Hebrew culture was more concerned with hearing than vision may be kind of tricky to defend because of the dominance of this metaphor of light. We also have visual reference present in the idea of the imago Dei and in the claim that Christ is the icon of the invisible God, the image of the invisible God. I have read that the optic nerve has 18 times as many senses as the cochlear nerve in the ear. It's that much more sensitive. We find it easier to train our eyes and to be attentive than most of us do with our ears. Our vision is selective. We can aim our seeing more readily than we can our hearing. I used to have a German Shepherd who could aim her hearing with her ears. It was really cool. She was like, wow, I wish I could do that. Well, actually, I wouldn't want ears like that. We have eyelids and no earlids. And what that means is we often practice active non-listening. That is, we just tune everything out and we learn how to ignore sounds, even though our brain may be passively perceiving them. It's interesting that parents often warmly enjoin their children, look at me when I'm talking to you. And then they cruelly play this game where they pretend not to see their kids. Where's Johnny? Do you see Johnny? I don't see him. What are they doing there? Why do we do this? The possibility of being invisible does, however, seem enticing. More enticing than the possibility of being inaudible. Everyone's had that dream where you're talking and no one understands you or can hear you and you just can't get it out and nobody can hear you. But Harry Potter's invisibility cloak is kind of cool. We kind of like the idea that again, these senses orient us differently. We tell our children that they should be seen and not heard. Okay. Sight orients us in space, and film, theater, dance, and architecture are among visual art forms that describe or enact how we make our way in the world by occupying and navigating space. If you think of the way in which people imitate the posture or gait of an admired performer, they kind of start walking like somebody they admire. Or you think of, I think of the elegance that Cary Grant's posture or his bodily movement, or Fred Astaire. I have to mention Ginger Rogers. I was saying to somebody, you know the line about Ginger Rogers, she did all the steps that Fred did, but backwards and in high heels. So this is... Sound, I don't think, conveys that kind of knowledge. The seeing of how people move their bodies is a remarkable display. The sound of our voices might achieve a similar effect, but I'm not sure it's powerful. I'm fascinated when I meet people who spend a lot of time on how they look, and when they speak, they give the impression that they've never thought about the quality of their voices. I don't know if that's a prejudice for one sense over the other, or it's a reflection of the assumption that it would be inauthentic to modulate our voice, but it's perfectly sincere to spend thousands of dollars on clothes or cosmetic surgery. How are we privileging one sense over the other in such calculations? Let me quickly touch on the last three senses, beginning with touch. Touch is the sense that's most related to personal intimacy. In Mark 1, Jesus sees a leper and, moved with pity, stretches out his hand to touch him. He says, "Be made clean," and so the audible command seems to affect the healing, but the act of touching seems to be relevant as well. And earlier in that chapter, he heals a man with an unclean spirit by voice alone, but then he heals Simon's mother-in-law without a word. He takes her by the hand, he lifts her up, and that dismisses her fever. And then, of course, there's the instance where Jesus is touched by a woman in search of healing and is healed by virtue of her touching him. People who brought children to Jesus for laying on of hands, there's a use of touch that's still employed in various liturgical settings. Of the three senses we've looked at so far, touch seems to be the sense that best conveys well-being between persons, harmony between persons. It involves presence. Sound and sight are conveyable from a distance with technical means, but touch requires proximity. Despite AT&T's reach out and touch someone claim of the 80s or whenever it was that was their slogan. Touch requires deliberateness. I can be heard or seen by people whose existence I don't even recognize. But touch is always mutual and selective, except bad touch. It amplifies its uniqueness as the sense that is most richly personal. We also come to know the non-human creation through touch. Gardeners rely on the feel of soil and of plants almost as much as on sight or smell. People who work with animals communicate with hands as well as eyes and voices. The experience of hardness and softness, of heat and cold, of rough and smooth, of sharp and dull, of pain and pleasure, these are all modes of understanding the nature of creation's goodness and beauty. The sense of taste, through its metaphorical use, has become linked with discrimination, the good kind of discrimination. We are enjoined to taste and see that the Lord is good. We're invited to make an act of judgment in taste. We're told to long for the pure milk of the Word because we've tasted the goodness of the Lord. And when we taste something, unlike what happens when we hear or see or touch something, we almost inevitably make an assessment of whether or not we like it. And so whether or not we want more of it. Seeing or hearing may encourage us to go on looking or listening, but seeing or hearing also may invite an effort to understand something in an articulated way. Taste seems only to require affirmation or rejection, except for gourmets. Gourmets try to understand the taste of a food or beverage. The rest of us, Cretans, just either savor it or spit it out. We speak of something being an acquired taste, which means something we've learned to like, but we don't typically speak of an acquired sight or an acquired sound. We tend even to speak of an acquired taste for sounds or sights. Walter Ong writes that taste is a yes or no sense, a take it or don't take it sense. It lets us know what's good and what's bad for us in the most crucial physical way. For taste concerns what we are inclined to take into ourselves by eating. What will by, and here's the 50-cent word for the day, intussusception, intussusception, what will by intussusception either actually become ourselves or refuse to be assimilated and perhaps kill us. Intussusception, I had to look it up, is the term in biology for the assimilation of new substances into existing compounds or living tissue. So when we take something into ourselves, it becomes us. So we have to be careful. We have to be discriminating. And finally, smell, the subtlest and most elusive of senses. Jeffrey Wainwright discusses in his book, For Our Salvation, in which he discusses all five senses in light of the work of Christ, but he discusses smell, particularly the use of scents in liturgical traditions. He, however, is a Methodist, and hence there's not a lot of emphasis on incense or oils or things in the Methodist tradition. And he says towards the end of the chapter, lest all this talk of incense and aromatic oils prove too much for some of my fellow Protestants, let it be noted that our nostrils also are sometimes engaged by the worship assembly. The flowers that are placed on our altar tables and around our sanctuaries continue a practice that goes back at least to the 4th century. Easter lilies perfume an entire building. The scent of pine has been admitted to our churches with the Christmas tree. Imported palm branches may retain just a trace of their natural odor on Passion Sunday, and their burning at the start of next year's Lent brings a pungency to the air as the ancient practice of the imposition of penitential ashes, which has caught on in our churches over the past few years. A freshly baked loaf of bread will improve the smell of any Eucharist, and failing that, there's always the reek of coffee at the fellowship hour. I want to close with a summary paragraph from a book called The Education of Desire Toward a Theology of the Senses by T.J. Goringe, Gorringe. He says, like taste, smell cannot be measured scientifically. Aristotle wrote that our power of smell is less discriminating and in general inferior to that of many species of animals. Men have a poor sense of smell, and our apprehension of its objects is bound up with pleasure and pain, which shows us that in us the organ is inaccurate. That's Aristotle's judgment. Today, however, we're told that a healthy person may be able to detect between 10,000 and 40,000 different odors, which actually is quite discriminating. As with taste, there is not a highly developed vocabulary of smell. We say that smells are like something, X and Y. This smells like something else. What this means is that it represents the world to us. Far from denigrating smell, it shows that smell is ineffable. How do you describe the aroma of coffee, asked Wittgenstein, or of grass after rain, or of pine forests, or of autumn, or of roses? Perhaps we don't have a vocabulary because the phenomenon is so complex. Famously, smell is bound up with memory. When all else is gone, said Proust, smell and taste bear unflinchingly in the tiny and almost impalpable drop of their essence, the vast structure of recollection. And Helen Keller, who famously was deprived of sight and sound, describes smell as a potent wizard that transports us across thousands of miles and all the years we have lived. In summary, it's worth noting that among the senses, sight and sound seem to have the capacity for complex, intelligible communication in ways the other senses do not. There are no sonnets or sonatas or symphonies for the nose, palate, or skin. And I think this may be due to the way that in which sight and sound orient us in space and time more intensely than do taste, touch, or smell. This quick survey of the senses may seem like a strange or exotic or quirky way, sketchy perhaps, to end the conference, but I think it's helpful to consider how our bodies engage creation, that is, how we perceive creation's meaningfulness, its beauty, its harmony, and that different senses offer different capacities for discernment and for delight. We live in a culture that offers abundant opportunities for sensations, but we're so often glutted with sensory experiences that we find it difficult to attend to them perceptively. Our lives are all too rarely ordered lives. And if our lives are chaotic, we're tempted to believe that life itself is chaotic. If our experience lacks an essentially harmonious quality, we find it easy to question the claim that God is love, and that his love has been made manifest in his creation. And so it's necessary for us to practice forms of deliberate use of the senses, even something like asceticism, in order to properly delight in the meaningfulness of the harmony available in creation in our embodied lives. Ascetic practices are sometimes assumed to be expressions of disdain for the body, but on the contrary, the disciplines necessary for being in tune, both audibly and spiritually, are not in service of a thin austerity, but they finally serve a glorious abundance. I would like us to close by singing in harmony, if you are so moved. Actually, I was just going to do a chord, but Greg Wilbur suggested let's do the doxology, because that's something that many people still know how to harmonize to. And we figured out it must be in the key of G, and here's a G. So harmonize if you can do so. Ready? Praise God from whom all blessings flow. Praise